How are you?
Nice to see you.
You too. So now when I run through the list of all my friends in Washington, I was like, yep, his friend, and I've gotten beat up by a number of them for like, why not making this your conference? So you have this huge fan club. Mike Lee says hi. I want to just talk to you about first, let the crowd know your background and why you're running for the Senate.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of the gathering. It is an honor to be here. I'm a dad, I'm a husband, I'm a neighbor, and for a long time I worked on Capitol Hill. I worked for 3 United States senators. Then I went over to the House of Representatives and I was the executive director of the Republican Study Committee. Later, I was Ron DeSantis' chief of staff in 2018 when he ran for governor. And for the past 4.5 years, I've been vice president of government affairs at an organization called Club for Growth. In 2020, when they closed our schools, closed our churches, closed our free and open government, our Capitol complex, I looked at my kids and I started really getting concerned about what their future opportunities were going to be limited to. We crushed their economic opportunity with the inflationary spending. We crushed their opportunity when it comes to all the policies that Tim Kaine and Joe Biden have been advancing. The radical left is basically creating, I think, a vacuum to be filled in Virginia because there's far too many voters that don't really have a political home. And I think what we saw in 2021 with Governor Glenn Youngkin winning a statewide office, of course it was in an off year, but he created the blueprint for candidates like me, new conservative leaders, to try to step up and make a difference. We know that parents' rights, public safety, and the economic opportunities for the next generation are on the ballot in 2024. Joe Biden is incredibly unpopular in Virginia. And at the same time, I know Governor Youngkin's going to be closing out tomorrow. He's got 57% approval with only 32% disapproval. That's a 25% net approval rating in what's supposed to be a purple state. In 2018, when I was with DeSantis and he won Florida, we won by about 30,000 votes. He got into office and he cleaned out the supervisors of elections in Broward and Palm Beach. And he invested in the Florida GOP. We're seeing similar investments right now from Governor Youngkin in Virginia that I think are going to pay dividends to my race in 2024.
You know, I got to tell you, I know you're running for the Senate. Tim Kaine, what a nothing burger. Totally forgot. And he was like a vice presidential candidate for the Democrats. And I mean, whatever happened to that guy? Did he go into the witness protection program? Softball question, I realize, for a candidate running against him, but really, I mean, you totally forget. Although I do have to tell you, my office is where Midtown meets Buckhead in Atlanta, and during the entirety of the Trump administration, there was one house that kept its Clinton-Kaine sign in its front yard for all 4 years, and then after the administration was over, they did not put a Biden-Harris sign in the yard, they put a Stacey Abrams sign in the yard. But otherwise, Tim Kaine, if he wasn't on that sign, I'd forget he existed.
Yeah. Well, he doesn't have a whole lot in his record that he can stand for, other than the fact that he's become a radical socialist, just like most of the other senators. Tim Kaine has been on the ballot 9 times in Virginia. He's been in elected office for almost 30 years, and he actually votes with Bernie Sanders 94% of the time. I don't think that Virginia or America can afford 94% of socialism. When you try to unpack the Inflation Reduction Act, when you unpack the Biden stimulus, all the omnibus appropriation bills that Tim Kaine has voted for, you know, this is a legitimate issue with inflation. One thing that I like to talk about is the cumulative effect of inflation since March 2020, when COVID was the lockdown, millions of jobs shed every single week, and the cumulative effect, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, is 18.43% inflation on the American people. And unless you've had 18.43% wage increases, you're worse off today than you were at the beginning of COVID. There's a viral song that's come out there by a guy named Oliver Anthony out of Farmville, and it's called Richmond North of Richmond. Tim Kaine,
a good title.
Tim Kaine admitted earlier today he's never even listened to the song. And this guy's from Farmville, Virginia. I've been in Farmville. I was there about a month ago. And that song replaced Try That in a Small Town by Jason Aldean as the #1 song in America. I think that there's issues that are resonating with the forgotten voter and the soft Democrat, the independent, that we can go after in our campaign and very much attract people like Oliver Anthony to a political system that's actually going to represent them, the people, not the politically well-connected, not the career politicians. Obviously, my career is very much targeted in my work on Capitol Hill. But I learned by witnessing those conversations how these members talk to each other. And in 2020, there was this political fear that swept our country. Nobody was willing to stand up and say no. Well, I'm a dad, like I said. I have 4 kids, Nadeline, Paislin, Raylan, and Prescott, ages 13 to 18 months. I'm used to telling them no all the time. I'm used to telling them to slow down or not to do something, right? I'm a parent. But I think the political fear spread like a wildfire. And obviously, I heard some of the speakers earlier today talking about Hawaii. Joe Biden is MIA. And I think that this is Joe Biden's Hurricane Katrina, if we're being honest. The fact that he hasn't been down there to Hawaii yet, obviously they're working with the emergency agencies to try to get them the federal aid that they need. But Washington's in recess. Biden's on the beach. We need to get Congress back to work. I've called on Congress to come back into session on Monday. There's no reason that Kevin McCarthy can't bring the House back. There's no reason Chuck Schumer can't bring the Senate back. I think that we need a government that is representing the needs of the American people, defending our rights and having a constitutionally limited approach to the overall intrusion that we've witnessed during COVID. I talk about the political fear being contagious in Washington. I also think political courage is contagious. And you need more people that are willing to stand up and fight for the American people.
All right, I want to ask you the political questions here and just the dynamics of your campaign in Virginia, because everyone who pays attention to politics now really does think about Northern Virginia. And Northern Virginia is so Democrat, and yet Youngkin could win. And the parents of Northern Virginia seem to have been radicalized by a school lockdown system that even told them they were bad parents or doing something harmful to their kids if they hired their kids tutors when their kids couldn't go to school. I mean, how do you see that dynamic and when someone says, well, a Republican's not going to win the Senate because of Northern Virginia, what's your response now?
Eric, I think that the parents' rights movement is not ideological. I think that parents want what is best for the future of their children, and that's not Republican or Democrat. I think that school choice, parents' rights, parents having a voice in the classroom, what happened in Loudoun County was terrible. You had really, I think, an issue here where parents were told the schools know best. The school administrators swept that under the rug. They didn't even report it to the police. And then the student was transferred to another school where he sexually assaulted another student.
And just for those of you who don't know what the story is, in Loudoun County, a transgender student sexually assaulted a girl in a bathroom. The school district covered it up, and the girl's father was treated as the bad guy for wanting justice.
Yeah, so I think that ultimately when it comes down to parents, they are going to vote in the best interests of their kids. And I think that the radical progressive left that Tim Kaine is now a part of, people used to think that he was this moderate guy. He gets up there on stage, he plays the harmonica with bands. He's a folksy guy, right? He's bilingual. We all remember that from the Clinton-Kaine campaign in 2016. I don't care how good of a harmonica player he is. He's a damn socialist. And I don't think that the people of Virginia want socialism. I think that they want economic opportunity. The message of Oliver Anthony and the forgotten voter is going to resonate for the future until people actually wake up. And this song is surprising a lot of the career politicians. They're like, oh, this is amazing, right? But if you're actually out there, I've been campaigning in all corners of Virginia. This is Virginia. This is the message that they want our politicians to hear.
It's funny you mentioned this because Chris Murphy, the senator from Connecticut, is getting a lot of blowback from progressives for saying they should listen to the song and at least try to understand why someone voiced those things. Progressives eating a progressive senator alive for daring to say it. And yet it is a message that resonates. I personally love the title of the song because it's so evocative of what really does appear to be going on in the nation. These rich people north of Richmond in the Acela corridor, or whatever you want to talk about it, set so much policy for the United States.
Yeah.
They live in a cloistered bubble. They don't actually relate to the mother and father struggling with gas in their car because they've got great public transportation where they live, or they have their Tesla. They don't pay attention to grocery prices because their income's so high. They're not clipping coupons. There seems to be this out of touch group of people, even within the federal bureaucracy, that no longer relate to people outside that corridor.
I think 6 out of 10 of the wealthiest counties in America are in Northern Virginia. And it is largely fed by our federal workforce and contractors and the opportunity that big government provides people with good paying jobs. But if you go 60 miles away, if you get down to Farmville and you have median household income at about $75,000 for a family of 4, that 18.43% inflation that I'm talking about, that's 67 days of the year that's wiped out with the hidden tax of inflation. And those people are feeling it. I obviously live in Arlington, Virginia, very, very wealthy community. I'm not rich, but I am north of Richmond. And I think that I feel the $3.75 gasoline prices. I feel the dramatic increases in groceries when I'm buying groceries every week for my family of 6. And most people that are on that median household income can't afford the dramatic increase that we've had in commodities like food and energy prices.
And so much of it, let me stop there. I had the horrible misfortune a while back of having to fly into Dulles and take a car. I would much rather fly into Reagan. It's so much closer, and had to take the car and fight through. It's stunning to drive that corridor now from Dulles to Washington. You have, obviously you have the Boeings and the Lockheed Martins, but you have the Googles and the Microsofts and these massive complexes for all of these companies that just seem like they have to, as Kevin Roberts said, they've got to be as close to the imperial city as possible now.
Yeah, Capital One's another one.
It's insane to see, and that's a development that wasn't there 15, 20 years ago. It's this explosion in not just wealth, but the need for corporations to be able to be close to their lobbyists, who are close to the regulators, who ensure that people south of Richmond can never have a competitive advantage against them.
When Governor DeSantis was talking a little bit about the administrative state, and you basically have a very, very large number of workers in the Washington area that try to bide their time and oppose a new agenda, right? Some of us call it the uniparty agenda that's out there, and I think that that's what's ultimately bankrupting America. It's the fear to shut down government. It's the fear to not increase the debt limit. But the reality is that we do need to fight back, and we need to think about the fiscal reforms that are going to enable a new generation of prosperity. The debt limit agreement that happened earlier this year, first you had Limit, Save, Grow that all the House conservatives like Chip Roy were working on very closely with Speaker McCarthy. And then McCarthy realized, I do need to have a bipartisan agreement, and he basically chopped that deal up, and they called it the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And what it did...
like the Inflation Reduction
Yeah,
Act.
exactly. And what it did was it suspended the debt limit through January 2025. So when I get elected senator, this is going to be one of the first major votes that I get to take. And obviously, I hope that we have a Republican president where I'm, voting on confirmations for cabinet officials and other executive branch nominations. But the debt limit and our fiscal trajectory, I think, are a dramatic burden on the American people because it's feeding that inflation. I don't want to be a broken record here on why I think inflation is so important, but if Biden has another 4 years, or if Democrats have another 4 years over Washington, the fiscal trajectory is just going to get worse. Mm-hmm. And the debt and deficit situation is exacerbated by our mandatory spending programs, but the reality is that we pumped several $1 trillion of new spending into the economy at the beginning of COVID with the CARES Act, and then we had that Biden stimulus, then we had the Inflation Reduction Act, we have the omnibus appropriations. Washington cannot continue to operate that way. And I think that if you have the new conservative leadership in Washington that's willing to stand up and actually say, you know what, we can go to prioritization on the debt limit. It won't be the end of the world for a couple of months. Or, because really, who's going to lose the funding? They're still going to pay their net interest payments. Mm-hmm. There's not going to be a default. And when you think about what Congress is going to fight over in terms of a government shutdown, there's a lot of issues that need to be on the table because we need to reclaim and reassert our power of the purse. I know that Chip Roy is out there right now talking a lot about the continuing resolution fight that's about to happen in September. Speaker McCarthy and Chuck Schumer basically have a verbal agreement right now to do a short-term continuing resolution that's just going to back us up into the holiday season. That is the broken record of Washington, D.C. The political pressure up against the holidays, the crisis legislating. I'm sick of it. And I think that we need to stand up and tell them enough is enough.
I know one of the criticisms you're going to get on the campaign trail from the Republican side is that you don't fit the bill for the sort of Republican who can get elected in Virginia because you're conservative. When you look at the Republicans Virginia sent to the Senate, they would, I think, probably be more characterized as more moderate than you. How are you going to respond to what is an inevitable criticism from a Republican establishment that really doesn't want someone from Virginia who might actually fight against raising the debt in the country and not spending more money?
Yeah. Well, honestly, I think that Governor Youngkin is pretty conservative too. Mm-hmm. And he's proven that he can win because he's a common sense conservative. I think that my ideas on parents' rights and public safety and pro-growth economic policies, deregulation, reducing the tax intrusion of the American people through the IRS, those are real issues that people are concerned about. And I just think that the left has gone so far to the left that people are going to give me a shot. With the political establishment in Virginia, the Republicans, obviously you need their support in order to get elected. But I think that when we talk about school choice, when we talk about illegal immigration, the 7 million people that have poured across the border, the fentanyl crisis that we have in our communities, this has come up, I think, several times among many of your previous speakers. We had a very high-profile fentanyl overdose at Wakefield High School in February. And there were 4 children in the bathroom of a high school, 14-year-olds, that were doing drugs together, and it was corrupted by fentanyl. That comes from China to our border to our communities. And it's not just an issue for Texas and Arizona and Nevada and California. It's an issue for Georgia. It's an issue for New York, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Everywhere we have a fentanyl crisis. And I think that the public safety question of, are we going to allow for the continued hijackings? Are we going to allow for violent crime to be pouring into our communities? People are tired of it, and I just don't think that they're as partisan when it comes to the common sense policies and the solutions that we need to win.
Let's go back to parents real quick. The stories that came out of Virginia, and maybe it's just because of the people I follow on social media, a lot of them who live up there, but it seemed like some of the most atrocious stories about the treatment of parents during COVID came from those Northern Virginia school districts where they were treated as terrorists for showing up at meetings. They were barred from speaking. The one dad trying to get justice for his daughter was nearly prosecuted, all the pressure that came in. And then there were the bizarre stories about the parents coming together in public schools, black and white, hiring tutors, inviting in the kids whose parents couldn't afford it so they could still get the education. I mean, how does it even happen that a school board loses that much touch with their constituents?
It's a great question. I think that in the school boards, there's an overwhelming sense of they're smarter than the parents. And this is their profession. They know what's best for the kids. They know that the kids want to either identify a certain way or, there's obviously a big LGBTQ movement in our public schools. That's not just in the suburbs. I think that that's even in our rural communities. I kind of want to tell a story about our experience with school. My oldest daughter, at the beginning of COVID, she was in 5th grade. And she was pretty devastated when the schools were shut down. Everybody kind of remembers Friday the 13th, March 2020, right? It wasn't coincidental that it was Friday the 13th. And they did virtual learning for almost exactly 1 year. And when they brought the kids back, I walked my daughter to school that first day back. And there were clear instructions from our school district. 1, the kids had to wear a mask. And 2, they had to have their temperature taken before they could enter the school. And all the parents and students were lined up 2 by 2. And I mean, it stretched all the way around the sidewalk, past the buses, and almost past the parking lot. And I felt like I was entering East Germany, honestly. And it was one of those situations where I was more upset that day and more emotional dropping my daughter off at school in 5th grade than the day that I walked her to kindergarten. And so we tried to get her into private school the next year, and her sister got in kindergarten, and she got waitlisted, so she was in public school in 6th grade too. And a lot of the kids at lunch started to talk about who was getting vaccinations and who was not. And it became a bullying situation of like, the kids that were not vaccinated can't sit with their friends that are. And my daughter, she wanted to get the vaccination. And my wife and I talked a lot about it, and I think this is parents' rights. We told her, sweetie, we don't think that it's safe, and you're not going to get it. And she was upset because she had to deal with that in the public school system. But that story, I think, is indicative of the pressure of the radicalism in our communities, and that extends from the progressive families in Northern Virginia all the way into those school boards where they feel like they're enabled. But then when it starts to be your child, parents are standing up and they're saying, not anymore. Thankfully, we did get her into a really good Christian private school at the beginning of 7th grade, and she's just doing fantastic there. She's always been a high achiever for academics, but she's now in a community where these kids, they don't talk about politics like they do in public school. Mm-hmm. And obviously, Northern Virginia is a highly politicized environment, even for 6th graders and 7th graders.
Yes, it is. I'm glad I didn't wind up having to raise my family up there. God bless those of you who do. It's something. So now at the end here, as we wrap up, if people are interested in your campaign, where do they go? How do they help?
Yeah, that's a great question. Tim Kaine has over $6 million cash on hand. My website is scottparkinson.com. I've done a decent job fundraising so far, and I feel like we're going to have a very, very strong campaign. I believe I'm going to be the Republican nominee, and this race needs to be nationalized. We need to remind people how Tim Kaine used to be the chairman at the Democrat National Committee. We need to remind people that he was on the ballot with Hillary Clinton. Money in politics is really, really challenging. Fundraising is by far the hardest part. I'm extroverted. I can go out there, I could shake everybody's hand here over the next 3 hours and it wouldn't mentally drain me. But asking your friends and family and your supporters to chip in $25 or $100 or $3,300, which is the individual maximum for a primary, that's tough. And it's not even tax deductible.
Yeah.
So, thankfully we've had a good start at reaching out to folks and raising that money. But the Democrats, we know how well funded they are. They have Act Blue. Act Blue is basically the Democrat machine to target low dollar funding toward their vulnerable candidates. And they'll send out an email to their millions and millions of people on their list, and they'll say, okay, this week we need you to give to John Tester, Joe Manchin, and Sherrod Brown. Those are the 3 red states that Republicans can pick up. And those guys will get millions of dollars off of those solicitations. Colin Allred is running against Senator Ted Cruz in Texas. He's become a prolific fundraiser through the low dollar donors of Act Blue. The Republicans are working on developing something called Win Red. But Win Red cannot stand as strong as Act Blue yet. And so we need people to get used to that behavior of looking at our targeted races. I think Virginia is a very, very strong pickup opportunity for 2024, thanks to that work that Glenn Youngkin has done and the blueprint that he gave candidates like me. But we need people to chip in. And it is tough, especially when we talk about the burden of inflation, when we talk about your 401k becoming a 201k. I understand it. But if you want to try to save our country, we need to flip the Senate. And if you care about the Second Amendment, Tim Kaine's the deciding vote on the Biden pistol brace rule. If you care about pro-life policies, if you care about the next Supreme Court justice, there's going to be a vacancy. And that's why we need to win the United States Senate back.
We do. And Scott, I hope you're the guy to do it. Thank you for joining us. Scott Parkinson, candidate for the Senate in Virginia. Thanks a ton.
Thank you so much.
So glad you could do this.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.